Welcome another week to Mideast Realities. We have an exceptional guest this week, RobertFisk from Beirut, 21 years reporting about the Middle East, living and working in Beirut, traveling every week, sometimes every day. In the midst of war, he's been there the whole period of the peace process. He's here in Washington, and we're very fortunate to have him on Mideast Realities. Robert, thank you for joining us.
You're welcome.
We have a lot to talk about. You'll be on for the next couple of weeks on Mideast Realities, and we're terribly appreciative that you took a few hours to join us.
Well, it's nice to come here, even if it does seem a long way from Lebanon.
You know, we'll get to current events, we'll get to Kana, we'll get to the unique videotape that you've brought with you, but I'd like to talk about, and what we try to do on this program, is the overall situation. The so-called peace process, what's happened in the Middle East in the 21 years that you've been there. That essentially is the period of the Sadat Initiative, the period of Camp David, the period of the Lebanese wars, and it's a period of time when I personally have also been involved, but never as you have, never on the war scene, never on the day-to-day scene, never in the midst of the actual realities on the ground. And as you reflect back on this period, let's talk about the peace process itself. It looks rather different to people in the region than it does to people in Washington, doesn't it?
I put peace process in quotation marks when I write about it in my newspaper. It's an American expression. It's definitely not a Middle Eastern expression. Well, I mean, all one can say about the, quote, peace process, unquote, now, is that it's dead. It's finished. It's over. And the most remarkable thing I find in coming now to the States is the degree to which people don't realize that. I have to live the reality of the Middle East, and I'm on the ground. And I have not met anyone in the past 2 to 3 months, including those who originally, wrongly in my view, believed it would work, who doesn't now believe it's dead and finished completely. And at a point when statesmen, if that word is any longer applicable in the world, should be trying to look to how the issue of peace can be resolved or restarted. I come here and I find people still talking about getting it back on track, as if in some strange way there's been this minor hitch of building a Jewish settlement in occupied land, and it doesn't really matter, and Mr. Arafat will come back and get things working again. And as far as I'm concerned, living out there on the ground, the whole thing has come to an end and it's buried, and indeed the stake in the heart of it was the Ha Homa, or as it would be in Arabic, Jabal Abu Ghanem settlement.
All right, but we'll come back to that. Let's go back to the 70s, when the peace process started, the so-called peace process, in quotes.
The peace process started before the foundation of the State of Israel, didn't it? I mean, all those secret talks between King Hussein's ancestors and those who were going to run Israel. I mean, there's always been a, quote, peace process, but it's never worked. And and it didn't work with Sadat, because it turned out to be a unilateral one, and the promises on the Palestinians were never fulfilled. And the real problems with peace processes, if they're not going to be just, if they're not going to involve countries going back to their original borders, then it's not going to work. And if you look back on Sadat, the problem with the whole Sadat initiative was it didn't have any international guarantees, it wasn't backed by the United Nations, and at the end of the day, there was no way of ensuring that either side actually fulfilled all their pledges, and Palestinians were part of that.
And the promises about settlements, which Jimmy Carter and Anwar Sadat told us they had achieved at Camp David, the Israelis denied and said it would be for 90 days, just like now they're talking about a 6-month freeze. But the semantics of the situation confuses a lot of people. You have been putting peace process in quotes. I've been changing the phrase to domination process. What it's really about is American control of the region, isn't it?
I think it is about an American-Israeli peace. It is not about an Arab-Israeli peace. It's about a peace which is a piece of machinery which is produced by the United States and Israel together and is presented to the Arab world. And I mean, let's go back for a moment and look at one of the things that simply hasn't been covered virtually in the press anywhere, not just in the American press, of which I'm obviously very cynical. At the end of the Gulf War, Part 2, in other words, following the liberation of Kuwait, Part 1 being the Iran-Iraq War.
In quotes, I assume you're...
Yes, indeed. And Gulf War Part 1 was 1 million dead, remember. That was the Iran-Iraq War. That was a real war, a really, truly terrible war. The other one was pretty bad. if you go back to the aftermath of that, you'll remember that all the editorial writers in the Times and the Post were saying, well, Arafat backed Saddam, King Hussein backed Saddam, how long can they survive? They're finished. Nobody pointed out, a mere 2 or 3 years later, how remarkable it was that the only two Arab leaders to embrace Saddam Hussein after his invasion of Kuwait were the only two Arab leaders who then made peace with Israel. How extraordinary. Now, was that because we suddenly fell in love with them, or they realized that they'd made a mistake, or was it because they were now weak enough to make peace with Israel? And that, I suspect, is the reality.
Or desperate enough.
Well, in Mr. Arafat's case, probably, but weak enough. If they had been stronger, they would have demanded better deals.
Mm-hmm.
And, for example, the Syrians were not weak enough to make peace. They still wanted Golan, all of Golan. And they've stuck to that from the very beginning, because Assad has a confidential letter from former Secretary of State James Baker saying this will be 242, land for peace. And Assad, and let's not be romantic about the president of Syria, this is a police state, this is a place that has torture chambers and secret policemen, but Assad has this piece of paper, and he says, okay, it says land for peace, that was the promise, let's see it honoured. And if it's not going to be honoured, but of course what actually happens is, he won't then deal for peace without Golan, so he's then accused of being a person who wants war and is not interested in peace.
But I still want to go back to the phrase domination process. Isn't what is really going on in the Middle East an attempt to secure the client regimes in place, to secure American hold on the region, and to use Israel as a conduit for that, but knowing that the Israelis have no intention of withdrawing from very many territories or of leaving domination of the west area of the Jordan, the Americans have to play a game with the Israelis. They call it a peace process, but in reality they know that it's up to the Arabs to give and surrender. It's up to the Israelis.
I don't think it's quite that simple. I mean, I think if you go back, the desire to dominate the Middle East has been there for 100 years. I mean, the Ottomans dominated it until we turned them into the sick man of Europe. The Ottomans wanted to be Europeans. You know, all the late Ottoman pashas are all learning to play the piano and paint. So we called them the sick man of Europe, and we destroyed their empire, which is one of the reasons why we British and the French fought the First World War. And thank you very much for coming in and helping us at the end. If you go back, though, after the First World War, and this is when your peace processes began, we had...
The peace to end all peace.
The peace to end all peace. And we had your president come to Versailles talking about the famous points of the right of independence of subject nations from the past and so on. What happened after that, as you know, is the British and the French carved up the Middle East between them. The French had a mandate, they took Syria, they carved up and created Lebanon as an artificial state. They were going to get Mosul, they were supposed to have Cilicia, but Mustafa Kemal chucked them out of Turkey. We took over Palestine, Iraq for a period, and Jordan, Transjordan as it would have been called. And what we basically did, the French and the English...
We the West.
We the West. We the West then. You come into it after 45,
well,
when you came and joined us again in the Second World War. But what we did is we created client kingdoms that prior to that had effectively been vassals of the Ottoman Empire. So we set up all these kings and emirs, and they were very nice to us, and they sent their sons to English public school, or they went to learn diplomacy at the Quai d'Orsay in Paris. And basically we set up kings. We like monarchs. We enjoyed monarchs because we understand monarchs, because we're a monarchy, and the French used to have one. And they pretty much survived through until we got to the end of the Second World War. And of course the huge social, political, cultural changes that brought about meant that the domination of kings, the subservience of kings, ran its full course, and the people, what the Arabs call the Arab masses, which I think is a horrible phrase, and I also don't believe in it. Arabs decided they didn't want this anymore, so we were prepared as Westerners to accept a new series of clients, and these were colonels and generals. So we got Colonel Gaddafi, General Assad, Air Force General, Mubarak was a general, Sadat was a general, of course Nasser was the first one.
It's essentially a military government.
Yes, and they all wear British uniforms with little cross swords to show they're brigadier generals. It's remarkable, actually.
In Jordan, they still play the bagpipes, don't they?
By and large, the Arab generals did choose British rather than French uniforms. But in any event, and our basic attitude towards them was that at the beginning, we rather liked them. We originally, when the colonels took over in Egypt, we thought it was time that the old king went, the fat old corrupt king of Egypt. We were very happy when Gaddafi took over from the Idris regime, the monarchy, and we rather thought it'd be, even easier. These men are generals; they will snap to attention rather than just bow. And these people were treated with some kind of respect by us, unless they moved out of our orbit. I mean, Nasser was fine until he nationalized the Suez Canal, so we had to biff him with the help of the French and the Israelis. Saddam was great. We loved his invasion. The West was very happy to support his invasion, tacitly, of Iran.
Did we encourage it and finance it? And
not only did we do this,
arm it?
We gave, your country gave Saddam the very first photo reconnaissance pictures of the Iranian front lines when his men crossed the Shatt al-Arab. So he was fine, but when he invaded Kuwait, he had to be biffed, and he was. Gaddafi was fine taking over Libya from Idris until he seemed to take an interest in blowing up airplanes, and then he had to get biffed. So
and
basically,
the Shah was the guardian of the Gulf.
As long as these people basically did what we wanted, we didn't worry about their secret policemen or their torture chambers. Indeed, in Iran, the Americans gave some assistance in how to torture people.
And of course, it's this period which is the origins of Kuwait, Iraq,
Of course.
the 19th province of
course,
Iraq.
Of course. But the point I'm making is that the client quality which we, as you say, impose in the region, which we like to have in the region, has a problem in that we don't have a replacement for the generals. The generals are having increasing problems now, whether they're dressed in civilian clothes like Mubarak or whether they're still in uniform. The last of the generals was probably General Aoun in Lebanon. He was probably the very last of the generals. The problem is that there's no replacement. What we would like to replace them with are rather wealthy, fairly well-educated businessmen. We'd like to have a technocracy in power in the Middle East, which will fit in perfectly with the dollar economy, which will cut out armies that might go and invade the wrong country, which will not worry too much about human rights. We don't care very much about
And which will continue to send their sons and daughters to the right schools.
Unfortunately, however, for the West, though there is no democracy in the Arab world, and let us be frank about that, an awful lot of people in their despair, anger, fury, indifference, have chosen something which has much greater historical roots, and that's their religion. And so you found that the generals whom we liked because we thought they were secular have found themselves more and more engaged in brutal wars against effectively a theological or theocratic opposition. The Shah lost. The Algerians may yet lose. The Egyptians haven't yet lost, although if Mubarak went, I'm not quite sure what would happen afterwards. It's my theory that the Jamaat Islamiyah in Egypt want a military takeover. They've spotted, of course, that Mubarak doesn't have a vice president. And the reason he doesn't, if he appoints a civilian, the army might take over. And if he appoints a military man, the military man might say, oh, well, I'll run the show. So he's got a big problem.
He remembers how he got there.
The only man who has dealt so far successfully with an Islamist, in quotes, uprising, was Assad. The rebellion took place in February 82 in the city of Hama in central Syria. He surrounded the city with special forces troops and ruthlessly liquidated, exterminated virtually everyone in the city who had a free voice. But you have to admit, and this is not something one wants to do, that if you go to Hama now, there ain't no Islamic revolution there, and there isn't an Islamic revolution in Syria.
Since we're on the point, though, how powerful is Hezbollah in Lebanon and Hamas in Palestine?
Well, number one, Palestine doesn't exist.
You're correct. Occupied Palestine.
Occupied West Bank. I haven't seen a state called Palestine. Mr. Arafat may have seen it, but
you're absolutely right.
On planet Earth, I have not seen the state of Palestine.
In fact, it's worse now.
It ceased to exist at the end of the mandate. If there's a state, we'll talk about it as Palestine.
And the integrity of the occupied territories ceased at Oslo.
It did indeed. Well, we can come back to that.
But since we're at this point,
well, you raised a question about Hezbollah. I mean,
the power of the Islamic movements.
Okay, look, Hezbollah is a sheep that's changed its fur or its wool. When it began in 1982, it was uniquely a Shiite militia which was effectively fighting the Israeli occupation of Beirut.
The Israelis gave birth to it.
Oh yes, they created it.
Right.
As Iran saw in the most ferocious of the Shiite militias, Hezbollah, I don't know if the word is a tool, because I think that rather simplifies and sort of turns into a Hollywood picture. Hezbollah, for quite a period, became an arm of the Iranian intelligence service. Not totally, but part of it. And the Iranian influence over the activities of Hezbollah during that period, 82 to 86, particularly during the dying days of the Khomeini regime in Iran, was very strong. And at that time, there was a brutal war going on in Lebanon, which is not really appreciated here, maybe not in other parts of the world, between the security services of the West and the security services of Iran and countries which allied themselves to it. What you found, for example, by 1983 was a right-wing Christian government installed in Lebanon by the Israelis, supported by the Americans, and Beirut was being turned into a naval base. I mean, I would sit on my balcony in Beirut and see 23 NATO warships floating up and down outside. And a series of very cruel killings began between both sides. For example, we have the bomb against Fadlallah, which is widely regarded as being a bomb that had its inspiration with the CIA. We had a series of bomb attacks on the French embassy, which were believed to be with the assistance of Syrian agents. We had, of course, the US Marine bombing, October 1983, in which 241 US servicemen died, and the French within a few seconds, which is largely credited to the Iranians, although they continue to wash their hands of it. We had a mysterious killing of a man who had the name of a Hezbollah leader in a Tripoli, northern Lebanon hospital, which the Iranians largely attribute to two agents of the French intelligence service. They killed a peasant with the right name but the wrong guy. If they were French, and if they were aiming for this guy, they got the wrong one. We saw at that time a considerable assistance being given by the CIA to the Lebanese government in the arrest of large numbers of leftists and Palestinians, many of whom disappeared forever, and they're believed to have been executed. The man whom the Iranians believed was involved in assisting the name collection for the Lebanese government was a man who later was kidnapped, and he was a CIA officer in Beirut. So you had a whole intelligence war going on there, in which Hezbollah automatically became involved, as indeed virtually every other militia in Lebanon did.
And Hezbollah today, in terms of its strength within Lebanon?
Hezbollah has changed again. Once Rafsanjani came to power in Iran, the Hezbollah, which has, whatever you think of their leadership, and they are very ruthless, they also have some intelligent leaders. These are not stupid people. And they understood that two things had happened. First of all, that the kidnapping of innocent Westerners was a very serious political error. Secondly, they realized that there was going to be a return of some form of political life in Lebanon, and they strove to put members into parliament, and they got them in. They became a political party, and they converted their struggle against, quote, the West, unquote, into a resistance struggle against Israeli occupation. And now largely their military side is engaged in attacks against Israeli occupation troops inside Lebanon. And as such, of course, under international law, the people of a country have the right to resist an occupying force. And the Hezbollah are Lebanese. They're not Iranian. They may receive Iranian money. They do. $400 a month to fighters, I believe, is the figure. But they are Lebanese citizens, and they have Lebanese passports, and they are fighting in the south an occupation force. So they had started as a creature that was created by the Israeli invasion of 82. They became an arm, if you like, of the Iranian intelligence service. They got deeply involved in this ruthless intelligence war between West and East. And now, very much through their own thinking, not because they got orders from Tehran or orders from Damascus or orders from the moon or wherever Hollywood would create it, they have adopted a political military front which they think works. I think there are a lot of problems with it, but the fact of the matter is that they've changed.
And their future, in your view, after 21 years living with them?
Well, number one, I don't live with the Hezbollah.
Well, I mean, living in Lebanon.
Well, they haven't existed for 21 years either. The future of the Hezbollah, well, they lost some seats in the last election, but clearly their MPs work very hard, so there still is a political foundation to the Hezbollah within the Lebanese context. If the Israelis left southern Lebanon unconditionally, according to UN Security Council Resolution 425, the Hezbollah would effectively cease to exist as a militia force. It would be the end. However, the Hezbollah can count themselves lucky that the Israelis are not going to withdraw unconditionally from southern Lebanon, so their future is assured.
You're watching Mideast Realities. I'm Mark Bruzonsky. I'm your host for this program. And we have the exceptional opportunity of having Robert Fisk with us, who's been for almost a quarter century the correspondent of British newspapers in the Middle East.
You make me feel old. You make me feel old.
Well, you've got seasoned understanding of a region that in this country we have so few people to speak with. So it's a real opportunity for us and for this program. And as I said, you're watching Mideast Realities. This program is on this channel this time of the day every week. And we're discussing the peace process. The domination process, the peace process in quotes, and I'm trying to sort of get your analysis, not just of the current moment, but of the whole 20-year period since Camp David. It'll be the anniversary next year, in fact.
I think you're making a mistake to see it as a composite 20 years. I think there's a great deal of difference between the whole Camp David setup and what happened in 1991. You're forgetting the, quote, New World Order. The aftermath of the Gulf War changed the dimensions and the mechanics of, quote, peace in the Middle East. Mm-hmm. You cannot look back and see it as a sort of gradual train that moves across the desert that started in Camp David or Sadat's visit to Jerusalem. You've got to start this peace process collapse in 1991 with the Madrid conference. And I guess, one has been through this so often, but it needs to be said again. When Arabs and Israelis were invited to Madrid in the aftermath of Gulf War Part II, they were all told the foundation of the peace process was UN Security Council Resolution 242 of 1967, which says that all the Israelis must withdraw from all occupied Arab land in return for the security of all states, that includes Israel, of course, in the area. That was the foundation. That's why the Arabs went to that conference in Madrid. And it was because he didn't like 242 very much that Shamir went to the conference very much distrusting what would come out of it. But that was the deal. Land for peace. Land for peace. Land for peace. That was the promise made by the United States government, and they were the guarantors. I remember going to Madrid, and officially it was going to be a UN, Soviet, or Russian, American peace. And I remember going to the American offices at Madrid, and there were hundreds of State Department employees. And then I go to the Russians. Now I go to the United Nations, and there'd be about 8 people with a fax machine. And go to the Russians, and there'd be about 5 people in their office without a fax machine. So it was an American guarantee. So the Americans effectively underwrote and guaranteed 242, land for peace, the Madrid conference. Now, what went wrong? The whole series of things went wrong, but what really decided that it wasn't going to work was the Oslo Agreement in secret in Norway between the Palestinians and the Israelis, because this enabled the Israelis to renegotiate UN Security Council Resolution 242 rather than adhere to it. Because from that moment onwards, instead of it being total Israeli withdrawal from occupied Arab land in return for total security, it became a withdrawal from this little bit if you do the following, and maybe we'll do that. And that was the end.
You seem to be implying that what the Americans said at the time of Madrid should be taken honestly and seriously. The Americans never had any intention of pushing forward with that.
So you tell me. So you inform me.
Do you believe they did?
I work in the Middle East. I'm on planet Earth out there. I'm not living here. All I can tell you is that in the Middle East, people still believe that if promises are made, promises are meant to be kept.
The continuity of American disingenuousness in dealing with the Middle East. The continuity
Mark,
of American...
you don't need to go back to America. Look at the Balfour Declaration. And look at Lawrence of Arabia's promises to the Arabs during the First World War.
And look at the 1918 conference.
We wanted the Jewish communities of the world on our side, and we wanted the Arab communities. So we promised the Arabs complete independence for all their states in the Ottoman Empire, and then Lord Balfour, British Foreign Secretary, announced that Britain would lend its support to the foundation of a Jewish homeland in Palestine, not in the little bit of Palestine that's Israel. He promised support, remember, for a Jewish homeland in all Palestine, including the West Bank and Gaza. So not only did the British...
I'm Mark Bruzonsky, your host for this weekly program, Mideast Realities, and thank you for watching. If you too are concerned about the situation in today's Middle East and about U.S. policies toward that crucial region of the world, and if you'd like to meet like-minded persons, why don't you come to one of our weekly social meetings? I'll be there, of course. Just give us a call for details.